Welcome to Holy Week. It's grim and glorious Holy Week. When I grew up here in Henderson County, I grew up on the other side of the county in the Green River Valley. And I was raised in a primitive Baptist church where my family had worshiped for many, many generations. And they're good, hard-working, wonderful folk. And we had Easter and Christmas as the bookends of our church calendar. And as a little girl, I dreaded and I looked forward to Easter. I loved the new dress that my mother made and the lacy socks and the patent leather shoes. And I just couldn't wait to start gathering the eggs and boiling them, making up that vinegary dye and balancing them on those little wired holders to dye them with my brother. It was a process, and we would wait for them to dry, and then they went into a basket and waited a few days, and aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters hid them for us for Sunday morning. Now, in the tradition I grew up in, we went basically from palm waving to Easter lilies. But the part that I really dreaded about Easter had to do with guilt, the guilt of the crucifixion. Now, I was very familiar with this story because we were given that story with the altar call 3 or 4 times a week at church. I heard the story preceded by Just As I Am. And I would hear this on Sunday morning and Sunday night, and then I would just be wrecked with guilt because I'd eaten my brother's cookies and I had disobeyed and I hadn't helped my grandparents, and I got caught cheating on a math test because I'd given the answers to my best friend, and I didn't know if I felt worse about being caught or about the cheating, and then that in itself was a whole other capitulation into guilt. And I was very worried about all of these things. And then I thought about the crucifixion and that God having his son, a perfectly good person, die a horrific death for me because I had cheated on some math and eaten somebody's cookies. I thought this was a big overreaction, a huge overreaction by God. I didn't understand it at all because I was young and I didn't understand the meanness and the wickedness of human beings and of the world. And as Easter came up, I realized that I was going to get a real dose of the horror and the agony of the crucifixion. And I would start worrying about it, feeling terrible about it. And so by about Friday afternoon, I had this game down where I convinced myself that because Jesus was God and God was the Trinity and Jesus was the Trinity, that Jesus did not feel any pain and suffering because he couldn't have if he was God. And that's the way, as a little girl, I could cope with this week. And I didn't understand the incarnation. So, Father, forgive us all for not understanding it as children or as adults. I didn't grow up with the tradition of Holy Week. I found that when I was an adult, I'd gone to seminary, and I discovered this amazing framework, this process called Holy Week. And I had never heard of Ash Wednesday or Lent, Pancake Tuesday. I could have gotten behind that one. Or Monday, Thursday, Good Friday. I never understood why it was called Good Friday. So when I discovered this Holy Week, I thought this was a way for me to understand it. I thought. Of course, the rub with faith is that it's a series of contradictions. It's very hard to hold logic and understanding and love and compassion together. We have a series of tensions in our faith at all times, and very few clear answers. And I'll be the first to say that I don't understand divine forgiveness or the resurrection. And I don't really understand pure divine love. But I do understand what it's like to be a frail human being, imbued with all of our emotions. And the characters in this week's story are very complex. I can identify with Judas. Most of us want to shun from Judas, but I think Judas held the best and the worst of all of us. He was from the southern part of Judea, from Kerioth. That's what his name means. Judas Iscariot means of Kerioth. And he was considered to be one of the best, if not the only, proper Jew who was of the followers of the Nazarene. In that country, just like many countries, there was a stereotype about which region held the smarter, brighter people. And they didn't come from up north, from Nazareth and from Galilee. So there was Judas, who was good with money, good budgeting skills, and he took care of the money for the Nazarene and his followers, and he arranged the meals and the lodging, and he traveled with them for years. And if you've traveled with someone for any period of time, you get to know them well. When you eat meals with someone, break bread, share accommodation, you get to know them very well. And no doubt there was a friendship that grew between Judas, the disciples, and Christ. We don't often think of Judas as a friend. He knew Jesus well. It's very possible that Judas was also a freedom fighter, an anti-Roman freedom fighter. They existed then, they exist now, because after all, the Jews had been looking for a Messiah, someone to free them, for over 1,500 years. That's 5 times longer than the United States has been a country. 5 times longer. And they only had a taste of freedom a few years now and then over those 1,500 years. And I can really identify with Judas perhaps getting antsy and impatient because he wanted freedom for his people. He wanted a Malcolm X, not an MLK. He probably saw that the teachings of the Christ were wonderful for peace times, but not if you wanted a revolution and liberty and your people to be free. So why did Judas make a deal with the high priest? Who approached whom first? Was it because of the money? Did he need 30 pieces of silver? Or did that make it a clean transaction for the high priest? Did he do it because he wanted revolution? Because he probably expected that the priests would arrest Jesus during the daytime in the temple, in the middle of the Passover festivities. They say 30 to 50,000 more people then arrived in Jerusalem than were normal for the Passover festivals. And the Roman guards would have been very nervous, and they would not have been in the temple. Maybe Judas wanted Jesus and the high priest to have a showdown. Christ would either have to do a miracle and proclaim he was the Messiah, or maybe back off and make room for a military Messiah. We don't know why he made that arrangement. We do know that he had to wait, and I find waiting very hard, especially when I know something big is going to happen. And there's a time limit. And the time limit was sundown on the Sabbath, and the Passover was going to be happening. Judas would have gone back and stayed probably in Bethany with Jesus and his friends, and they would have had more meals and slept and talked and perhaps visited with people. And I wonder, was that hard for Judas? Was he on pins and needles? Was he asking himself, have I done the right thing? Have I made the right decision? Am I doing this for the right thing, for the greater good? Maybe he was justifying himself. And when Jesus looked him in the eye, man to man, friend to friend, and said, I know you're going to betray me, did Jesus' blood boil? Did Judas's blood run cold? Or was it just a casual remark? And one thing I wonder is, when did Judas know he had been played? He was a small pawn in a big picture, but he thought he was the main pawn for a while. And I'm guessing that when he went to meet the priests and their servants, not even the high priests, but the priests that were sent, and he saw the Roman guards, that's when he realized, oh, this has gotten out of hand. Because the priests could arrest, embarrass, antagonize, slap Jesus, but they could not condemn him. They could not make an official crucifixion condemnation. And he made his deal with the priests, not with the Romans. Maybe that's when he realized he was really out of his league. And I can understand this. How many of us have not made a judgment in error about a friend, about a business decision, a relationship? How many of us have not done something that got out of control and we have wanted to pull it back, to have a redo? And that's what Judas wanted to do. So he went to the priests, and we know that he was ashamed, and he withdrew his accusations. He threw the money at them, and he said he was wrong. And this meant he was a loose cannon. He was a liability. He was a detail that needed to be wrapped up, because if the proper Jew withdrew his accusations, there could be a bigger problem. And so the priests let Judas feel the full weight of being a scapegoat. They made it all out like it was all down to him. Maybe they wanted him to take his life. But we know that Judas left, and he had no friends to go to because they had dispersed and run off and were hiding in some places. His teacher was under arrest. Things had spun terribly out of control, and he was alone and sad and depressed and filled with shame. Shame. And he couldn't go forward and he couldn't go backwards, so he took his life. And even his lifeless body was a problem for the priests. They could not have it hanging there on the tree. It would be advertising something that did not go to their plan, and so his body was taken down. It was put outside of the wall. And this wall around Jerusalem served a lot of purposes, but the main thing it served at this point in time was somebody was in and someone was out. Someone was right and someone was wrong. Someone was excluded. And there was Judas, and his body had to be taken outside the wall to be buried. And what about his soul? I guess judge not, so we be not judged. The main character, of course, in this story is the Christ. And this is the week that Christ was born for. He became incarnate, a full human being, for this week to happen. And I wonder if when he was riding into Jerusalem and the palms were waving and people were throwing their cloaks down to create an improvised red carpet, was he happy? Was he proud? Was he giving a royal wave? Or was he nervous or downcast? Was he filled with humility? Or maybe disappointment because these people had so narrow-minded that they couldn't look beyond their own immediate needs to understand his teachings? Or did he know that the hosannas were going to soon turn to crucify, crucify, and that people turned so quickly? We know that Jesus had the full range of emotions because he went around the corner and he saw Jerusalem and he wept. That's not a few tears trickling. That's real weeping. And he was sad. Why? Was it because he was not going to see Jerusalem except a few more times? Was it because he knew that the city would be destroyed in 50 years and then again, and it would always be in tension and turmoil? Was it disappointment of rejection? Not a good feeling? Sadness is tiring. We also know that Jesus felt anger. Righteous anger. He went into the temple, which was the center of religious life in all of Judea during the highest week of festivities. And he saw his Father's house, a sacred house, being misused. And he saw nepotism at its very highest. He saw Jews who were taking advantage of other Jews. They were selling animals at 4 and 5 times the price for sacrifice. The taxes were high. The temple tax was high. The exchange rate for the special temple money was high. And he saw people who had trusted their leaders being misused by their leaders. So he was angry. And anger and sadness are exhausting. And Christ needed to sleep, needed rest. Don't often think of this, but he needed rest. And he went back to Bethany. And he also got hungry like we do, because we know that the next morning he was hungry enough that it's mentioned in the scriptures that he wanted a fig to eat, a sweet, delicious fig. And he went to this lovely tree that was leafed out. There were no figs. And it made him angry. Angry enough to curse a tree. He was hungry. And of course, he was also angry with the high priests, who looked like they were producing fruit, but of course were not. Both were shams. I don't know about everything that happened in the next few days, but Jesus and his followers would have been somewhere in Bethany, eating and drinking and talking and resting, and maybe some of them wanted to go into the city to meet the friends and relatives who'd come in for the big holiday, but they did not. At least Jesus did not. So was he low and depressed and sad during these days? Or was he lighthearted? Was he recounting stories of what had happened over the last 3 years or 33 years? We don't know. But as human beings, it's easy to imagine that. And then on Thursday evening, he would have walked with his friends, Judas and Peter and John and all of them, and they would have walked 2 miles into Jerusalem to the upper room. And I wonder, was he tired? Did he talk? Was he withdrawn? And when he arrived and presided over the Passover meal, did he have an appetite, knowing what was facing him? Was he annoyed at all that the disciples were so egotistical they were still bickering like children about who was going to get to sit where, to see how important they were? And when Christ washed the feet of his friends, which is very intimate, did he rub them with love? Did he look up in their eyes? Did he call them friend? Did he thank them? Did he weep because he would not see them again? And then there's that moment I always imagine when Jesus took the platter of blessed lamb that they brought from the temple that day, been prayed over, blessed, and he turns to the left and he hands it to his friend Judas. Just like we would hand a platter of turkey at Christmas. And did he smile? Did their hands meet? Did they look friend to friend, knowing what was about to happen? These were human beings. Now, we know this story gets a lot worse. There's the brutal arrest and the betrayal and the disappointment of people falling asleep and denying Jesus. And he was shuttled to 6 different trials over a great distance, and he would not have been carried, he would have walked. He was already tired. And we know that Jesus was humiliated publicly and privately, and beaten and tortured and mocked. And there was horrific pain. And though I never liked to think about it as a little girl nor as an adult, that the pain of nails going through flesh, and then the horrific isolation of feeling God turn away. So horrible must have been that isolation that in that moment Jesus gave up his vitality. He willed himself to die. Father, forgive us because we do not know what we do. Holy Week. It's grim and it's glorious. Now, as a child, I was naive not to believe or understand the feelings and the real incarnation of Christ. And I still think it's okay to feel dread and anticipation about Easter. I think it's a mystery. I don't understand God. I don't understand divine forgiveness. And it's this mystery that we can process during this week in our own human way. Mystery of how God sees our betrayal, our meanness, our insufficiencies over and over again. I think Holy Week is a wonderful framework. It's like dyeing eggs the old-fashioned way. Boiling them, dyeing them, letting them cool, putting them in a basket. It gives us time to process the human emotions of this week. So if at all possible, come back to the services on Thursday and Friday. Don't just go from glory to glory, because the crux of our faith happens this week in this pain and suffering. Welcome to Holy Week. Grim and glorious, but very glorious. Amen.